behaviors and adult relationships. What's the connection? What's the truth? What's the myth? There's a lot of myths that go around. We often, so many of us hear that people get into bad or toxic relationships because they've picked a bad partner. So today we're going to get into the nitty gritty of adult relationships and the actual impact your childhood may or may not have had on you. I'm trying to get the last little pieces up here so that I can see everything, so that I can make sure that I see your comments as you're coming in. I'm super excited that you're joining me today. I'm, for those of you who are new to me, Dr. Kerry Kerr-McAvoy. I am a licensed psychologist, and this place is where I talk about everything related to healthy relationships as well as dysfunctional relationships. So today we're going to be talking about the truth about child abuse impact on adult relationships. And there's different types of child abuse. There's not only neglect and psychological emotional abuse, but there's also sexual abuse and physical abuse. And each one of them has sort of a different ramification, a different effect on the sufferer. So I want to be able to talk about that as well. What does it do to you psychologically when you have a troubled home or parents who are psychologically immature? What happens to you to your sense of yourself? How do you manage boundaries? In what ways do you tend to seek other relationships? And then I want to jump into its impact on adulthood. Who are you likely to get into a relationship with? Now, I know that it's commonly thought that people who get into a narcissistically abusive relationship or have picked a narcissist, that somehow they must also have had troubled homes. So we're going to talk about, is that the truth or is that actually a myth? So let's talk first about the different types of child abuse. And probably the most common one, but we spend the least amount of time on it, is neglect. So neglect is when somebody is sort of left to their own devices. There's really a lack of parental support. Kids who are being neglected often have to fend for themselves. They often come home to empty houses. There's usually not a lot of monitoring going on when they encounter difficulties like school challenges or maybe relationship difficulties or even difficulties with one of their parents. One or both parents tend to be hands off, or they just don't know how to show up. So basically, this is sort of like what I call being raised by wolves. These types of children tend to learn that there's no one coming and that it really has to do with them managing themselves all on their own. They tend to be really hyper independent, but that can get them into a lot of trouble because children don't always know what they need. They may not know that they need to seek help, or they may not know that they're in a situation that's over their head, or there's complexity to it that they don't understand. And the other thing is, it creates a lot of stress and anxiety as a result of that, because they end up having to manage things that are outside their maturity. And because they're not psychologically prepared for it, then they're more likely to miss critical cues, more likely to end up in situations that are dangerous or maybe at least toxic. Or they may end up not being able to assert themselves for their best well-being. They may not know that maybe they're in the wrong class, or maybe that the teacher's being abusive. They may not know that their diet is not the healthiest, or they may not know even the limits of what they should and should not do. You can recognize these types of kids when they don't tend to have a curfew, or there's really no one aware where they're at or what they're up to. You may notice that there's really like no level of supervision. They just sort of tend to be on their own and managing things as they come up. Now, psychological and emotional abuse is similar and often like connected to neglect, but it's tends to be manipulation, triangulation. Usually the kids are being asked to be put into roles that they're not ready to occupy. For example, a common one is the parentified child. That may be the individual, the child who's then showing up and having to meet the parent's need to sort of like to soothe the parent, provide insight. Maybe they're the person this parent uses to sort of handle the rest of the kids. They're the pseudo parent for the family. Often these kids then end up, they sublimate, they sort of like put their own psychological needs aside, and they really show up for the needs of the family. And it really makes them vulnerable because they're not being taken care of, and they're not being able to focus on their own development because they're really handling issues that exceed their well-being. But also it means that they're under hypercriticism. Maybe they can't do anything right. They end up feeling that they're very defensive. Maybe they start to people please and fawn. I don't know if you caught last week's live where I talk about the fight, flight, flee, fawn, or freeze. I actually repeated two. Flight and flee is the same, but fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Then the people who are psychologically or emotionally abused often are the individuals that they learn to show up exactly whatever the adults need them to. They learn to put aside their developmental challenges or whatever's going on in their life in order to focus on the demands at hand, because that's the best way for them to stay in good shape with the people around them. I'm noticing that my connection for some reason is really spotty on the live on TikTok. Sorry about that. I don't know why I keep seeing this pop up that you guys are getting a poor connection. But so psychological abuse looks the same as it does for adults. Adults typically are not neglected. We are responsible for ourselves, so we don't experience emotional neglect except the degree that we may have a partner who withdraws and checks out. So it doesn't have the same impact on us psychologically, but everything that you know about psychological manipulation, like gaslighting, lying, deception, triangulation, inappropriate requests, boundary breaches, all of those things kind of fall under the umbrella of psychological and emotional abuse. Kids who grow up in that situation may really struggle to know what their limits are, to know what their boundaries are. They may either take on the role of being excessively responsible, really feeling a need to be defensively right, or they may be individuals where they feel like they're always the screw up because anything that goes wrong is sort of blamed on them, so they end up feeling like they can't do anything right, so they may end up having a real low self-esteem, imposter syndrome. They may struggle to even feel competent and have a really good sense of who they are and a good sense of how they feel about themselves. Then there's sexual abuse. And sexual abuse, obviously we know the extreme ramifications when it has to do with intrusion on the body that's inappropriate, but there's other forms of sexual abuse that we often don't talk about. Emotional incest, for example. Are you familiar with that? Have you heard that before? That's when a parent turns to the child for their psychological, emotional, and especially their more comfort needs. They may end up talking to that child about things that are going on between the adults that are inappropriate, that they shouldn't know about, details of the parents' intimate life that's really way beyond the scope of discussion to have with a child. They may end up witnessing things they shouldn't witness or be privy to things that they really shouldn't be aware of. Maybe the medical history of one of the parents that's really too much to be shared with that child. They may be also relied upon as sort of the pseudo partner, like instead of one parent turning to the other for comfort, that parent may turn to the child for comfort, and that child feels like they have to kind of show up to caretake and provide for that parent psychologically. So sexual abuse doesn't just include all the things that have to do with bad touch, good touch, but it also can include boundary breaches around psychological intimacy related details that really the child shouldn't be privy to or a part of. And then there's physical abuse. And again, we kind of think we know what physical abuse is, that it should be obvious. It's laying hands on somebody when they shouldn't. But it can be other types of intrusions, like it could be inconsistent or inconsiderate invasion of a person's body. I think, for example, kids who have a lot of medical issues may not understand why certain procedures are being done, why they're being exposed to certain things. And even though everybody's well-meaning and maybe they're trying to save that child's life, that could be really experienced to a child as if somebody is physically handling them, physically hurting them, and it may be experienced as physical abuse. So it's not only just outright violence, but it can include things that are just physical intrusions that don't have a container for the child to understand it. I heard, for example, years ago, I was witness to this. I was at a lab. It was for myself. I was getting a blood draw, and there was a parent who had a really young child in the room, and that didn't explain to the kid why they were there. I mean, I'm talking like 2, 3 years old. And I could tell this child didn't know what was happening because the kid was playful and easygoing and acted like everything was going to be great. But I knew this kid was there probably for a vaccination. Well, sure enough, the parent drags the child off to the back room for the shot, and then I start hearing this little girl screaming, just screaming at the pitch of her lungs. It was awful sounding. And I know that she had not been warned. She had not been prepared that this was just sprung on her. And now she was experiencing what she perceived as a very violent moment because there was no preparation or explanation of what was going on. So sometimes, oh, thank you for that gift. So sometimes physical abuse can happen inadvertently. We may not be aware, and the reason what we're doing is really good. But if there's not sort of the boundaries around it, the constraints that have to do with kids understanding what's happening, this can be a really traumatic experience. So let's talk about what abuse teaches kids and how this kind of carries on in our life if we experience these sort of early difficulties. So any kind of form of abuse, whether it's neglect or emotional, psychological, or sexual, physical, it makes children feel like they really don't have permission to say no. They find it really hard to assert themselves because when they have, it's resulted in some kind of negative outcome. Like those who get neglected, if they ask for their needs, like for example, hey, I'm having trouble with this, and then the parent either dismisses it, or maybe they psychologically abuse them and get very critical and put them down, or maybe they end up, incurring the attention of the adult that may be unwanted attention, or they end up getting some kind of physical ramification. They just learn it's better not to say anything at all. They learn to try not to incur attention, and certainly not to say no to something because it may lead to something that's really bad. I'm thinking a lot of different examples as I'm talking about this. When you're in a certain type of a home, especially when there's predators, people are really dangerous, often the best recourse as a child is to stay hidden. So you end up learning not to put yourself forward because any kind of attention could be the bad kind of attention. So you discover that it's just better to stay under, hidden. There was a movie years ago. It was like a little red wagon. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was painful to watch. It was about a mom and a stepdad, and there was 2 little boys, and one boy was being targeted severely. So the other boy sort of stepped up and stepped in, and it ended up just sort of being a really sad outcome. I don't remember the name of the movie, but it had to do with the name of the wagon. There was like a brand of a wagon that it had to do with. But sometimes we end up finding that it's just better to stay hidden, stay out of sight, because attention can attract the wrong kind of attention, and maybe that's just better not to have any attention at all. So it can be really hard for kids to know how to get help, who's safe, who to say something to. Well-meaning people, for example, a teacher may end up getting in touch with a parent, and then that activates a whole sort of system of setup of problems. I remember when I was working with kids, in fact, my first populations as a psychologist was with children, that often the children be afraid that if I reached out that I might accidentally say the wrong thing or reach the wrong parent, and I would activate a very dysfunctional system, putting that child more at risk. So kids just learn to sort of submerge themselves, to stay invisible, to ask for very little, to try to not upset anything, not to disturb anything. But they also become fearful of conflict, because conflict often will lead to confrontation or rejection. Maybe it leads to ridicule. And so these kids learn to be extremely accommodating, or they go to the opposite extreme, that they just sort of give up on the whole system and realize that nothing ever works, so they don't do anything. They do whatever they want constantly, because they feel like, I'm bad anyway, so let's just embrace my rebelliousness because I'm not going to win anyway. So you may find that there's sort of this overcompensation that kids have, that they kind of swing from one end to the other end, trying to protect themselves from potential harm. They may either emotionally isolate, or they may end up getting involved with people they really shouldn't way too fast, assuming because they haven't learned how to identify safe from unsafe people. So they just end up thinking everybody's safe or nobody's safe. So you'll just see this kind of funny way of them handling relationships. I remember in school, we talked about two types of families. There is the enmeshed family and then the disorganized family. Most kids who come from an abused home come from an enmeshed family system. But there's also those who come from more of a, is it disorganized? I'm not for sure it's disorganized. I think it's enmeshed or it's disengaged. That's the opposite. There's a disengaged family and then there's the enmeshed family. So an enmeshed family is where there's very little boundaries. Everything kind of belongs to everybody. You can't say no. There's sort of a collective group thought or narrative or theme that the family runs on that everybody's supposed to cooperate with and sort of get on board. Like if, for example, this is a really silly one, but if we all really like Friday night game night, even if you have one child who's an introvert who really hates Friday night game night, everybody's supposed to like Friday night game night. And anybody who doesn't then sort of gets piled on, scapegoated, attacked, gaslighted for having that opinion. So there's sort of what's called this group ego thing, where everybody sort of has to be on board and collectively do whatever it is that this family agrees to do. Think of, for example, I don't know if you've ever been on a dairy farm or been on any kind of farm. I grew up on a dairy farm, and we had chickens. And at one point, we had sheep. I think sheep's a better example. So if you threaten a herd of sheep or a flock of sheep, what they do is they crowd up. They get into one big group together and then just hang together, sort of acting as if there's safety in numbers. That's a great picture of an enmeshed family where there's this kind of glomming on to everybody and this collectively acting as if you're one organism. Most abused families or most dysfunctional families tend to be on the enmeshed side. So for example, if dad's having a bad day, everybody's having a bad day. It's not like dad knows how to soothe himself so that everybody then can go on and function in whatever way they want. No, the whole family shifts in order to take care of the hurting family member. I guess that's a really great way to think about it. And I just picked on dad. It could be mom, could be anybody with power. If that person who has power is having a bad day, then the whole family shifts itself and readjusts everything in order for them to sort of caretake that one particular person. And I think a really other great way to think about these families is that it's upside down. The parent should be the one who's in control, setting the boundaries, creating safety, developing trust, but unfortunately they're not. So the children end up having to manage their own emotional well-being because there's no one managing that for them. So what happens then? I'm going to talk about this next, and then we're going to take your questions. And we're going to talk next about what happens then on adult relationships. If you come from a home like this, what's its impact when you come to pick a partner? And then I want to get into why we need to be really careful and not attribute childhood issues to those of us who get into narcissistically abusive relationship. Why narcissistic abuse sort of doesn't fit the norm and why it's different. So what happens when you grow up in a neglectful home and you get to the age where you want to pick a partner and have an adult relationship? Unfortunately, kids who grew up in neglectful homes tend to anticipate that there is no one else out there. They pick a partner, but because they've experienced such emotional abandonment, they assume the partner is going to abandon them as well. And so they tend to be hyper independent and they don't tend to really rely on their partner. They tend to sort of reenact, and this is what also is so sad, is they tend to reenact what they experienced at home, assuming that that's sort of the norm of relationships, that you don't look to the other person doesn't know how to show up for your needs, that you're really on your own most of the time. And so they kind of act like they're in a relationship, but they're roommates with their partner. And they tend to pick people who probably do this. They tend to pick people who are more on the withdrawn side or avoidant side. So they end up kind of replicating the neglect experience in childhood. They replicate it in their adult relationships. So they end up just like they didn't feel seen or valued or cared for in their childhood, they end up not feeling very seen or valued or cared for in their adult relationships. And the thing that's kind of sad about all of this is that they often end up thinking this is normal, that's just what relationships look like. There isn't a recognition that there's something wrong and that it shouldn't be this way. So they may end up thinking that this is just how it's supposed to be, despite the intense amount of loneliness and maybe sadness and even depression they're feeling in these relationships. I think they end up feeling like wanting more is asking for too much and it's unreasonable, so they just don't. I know that I struggle with this. One of the ways it really has impacted me is that I struggle with knowing how to get help. So when I am sick, I don't know when to see a doctor. I don't know whether or not I'm sick enough to go to the ER. I really get weird around it. Because these kids have learned that to put themselves out there and request for something and having it denied feels worse than staying home or staying by themselves and being sick or dealing with whatever the difficulty is on their own. So it's kind of weird because you'd think that they wouldn't want the failure or to, obviously if I'm sick, I wouldn't want to die, but there's something that's been so kind of ingrained when you've lived in a neglectful home that you end up feeling like it's better to go without. The idea of being rejected and abandoned openly is so painful that you'll do other things as a way to navigate away from that fear of having it happen again. And unfortunately, this is what I found as an adult. It happens. I remember one time I was super sick with some cardiac symptoms. My heart was racing too much, and the hospital staff misdiagnosed me and made me feel really stupid and silly. Because it happens, they shouldn't have, but it did. And it ended up kind of perpetuating my sense of saying, see, people don't show up. This is why you don't ask for help, because you get this kind of response. So watch out for that. Watch out for the way that we can kind of anticipate people doing the same thing. And a person who had a non-neglectful background would have said, no, there's something wrong with this treatment and pushed forward. But because it's familiar, these types of people who've had the experience are more likely to collapse and give up faster when they really should. So if you grew up in a home where there's a lot of emotional or psychological abuse, your sense of self has barely been damaged. Likely you have been made to feel ashamed, feel really embarrassed, maybe taking a step out and doing something bold that takes ability to fail has not been possible. Failure's been seen as too risky. So you tend to probably be really careful and not take a lot of risks because you're trying to avoid the criticism or the attack or the vicious attacks you've experienced. Or you may have had people who've made you feel crazy, like no matter what you said, everything was wrong. So you've just learned not to share at all because it's safer to keep to yourself and stay silent and stay away from the whole mess than to take a risk and step out. So unfortunately, emotionally abused survivors tend to end up picking up partners who are kind of controlling or manipulative, maybe partners who kind of reenact again the criticism and the inability to be there. This group of people often either feel like they're not worthy of another person, so they underestimate their value and they end up in relationships where they give too much and they are too accommodating, but also, and it's where relationships that just aren't balanced. They may bring in a lot to this relationship and their partner is not. So it may be sort of this a discrepancy between what they're giving and what they're getting. And then those of us who've experienced sexual abuse may really struggle with intimacy issues. And you tend to see sort of one of two ends of reactions. There's the people who have then just become promiscuous because there are not good boundaries around one's body and one's safety. They end up thinking then the only way to sort of feel validated is to have that kind of attention. So they go out and sort of seek it elsewhere outside of the home. They sort of felt like the only time that their parents saw them was in this inappropriate connection. So then they end up feeling like, well, why not? All relationships have this inappropriate connection, so they just sort of continue it in a more of a promiscuous manner. But there's also those who then go the opposite direction that feels like they almost want to become physically invisible, and their sexual or gender identity they want to make invisible. Sort of like they sort of blame themselves for the attention, so they try to carry weight or they try to be androgynous or mask themselves in some way. They may maybe be extremely, there may be kind of over religiosity as a way to sort of protect any advances. But they do what they can to keep themselves safe from the unwanted attention that they felt like they couldn't keep away from themselves when they were in that environment where the dynamic was happening. I think when there's emotional incest, that's a situation where the child ends up knowing things they shouldn't know about adult relationships they're not really prepared to know. Again, you're going to see this kind of funny boundaries about what gets shared and what doesn't get shared, what's appropriate intimate information and what's not. So you're going to see sort of this mixed picture of sharing that really doesn't fit well, doesn't match really well, and partner selection that also probably there's forms of abuse. Like there's maybe they pick partners who are very sexually coercive or feel very entitled, or they might end up in relationships where there's a lot of shame and they can't talk about what's happening. So it ends up they just don't experience the full possible intimacy that one could experience in a dynamically physical, free, joyous relationship. When there's been physical abuse, what they've learned with children who've grown up with a lot of like domestic violence have learned to associate love with control and punishment. So they end up maybe picking partners who are either aggressive or controlling or prone to violence. They've also gotten very used to seeing people who don't know how to manage their own emotional regulation, and whenever they're upset, they lash out and then sort of like explode on the family. So they've learned that emotions are dangerous, and that it's either you should walk on eggshells with everybody or that not to how to regulate their own emotions. And I think the really scary part about kids who've grown up in a physical abuse is that the power dynamics is very weird. So the one that's the most violent tends to have the most power in the family. Everybody's doing whatever they can to keep that person from reacting. And so the child then may think that to themselves, that's power. To have people caretake you like that, to have people be intimidated of you like that, may make them feel not weak and helpless. And so they may end up then mimicking that when they get into adult relationships, thinking that's a way to protect yourself, is to sort of through might and power. But you might also have the child who grows up in that and sees that and then ends up picking powerful people, thinking that you are loved when somebody's sort of the super alpha in the relationship as a way to express like care and compassion. So they may end up missing the red flags that they're meeting a dangerous person, because to them that feels like somebody who's really showing them attention, a familiar attention, something they're used to. So the common denominator in all of these examples is that these kids have a real hard time developing a sense of self. They often end up settling for somebody that often recreates a dynamic that's familiar to them. And here's the other thing. I really dislike it when we on social media say that a person does it because it's comfortable, because it's familiar, that you get back into an abusive relationship because it's familiar. I'm going to tell you that's not true. You don't pick it because it's familiar. You pick it because you think it's possible to overcome. I really believe that we're psychologically always working towards a better version. We want to master what went wrong. We want to succeed with what failed. So sometimes I think we end up in these relationships because we think we can save maybe ourselves, maybe the young version of ourselves. Maybe we think we can save the troubled parent, the immature parent. But I think we get into it to overcome it, not because it's familiar. So I really want to just dissuade that. I think it's insulting to suggest, oh yeah, you got physically abused and now you're in a domestically violent situation now. Oh, it's just because it's comfortable to you. It's because it's what you knew and you just liked what you knew. No. If you really think about it, and any of us who've gone through something like this, you really think about it, you don't want to repeat. You wanted to leave. That's like a lot of us left home early or got out as fast as we could. We're not looking to replicate what we left. We're looking to sort of fix. and save ourselves from what we left. We're looking to sort of succeed where we felt like we couldn't succeed, and thinking that maybe now that you're an adult with more resources that somehow you can do that, not knowing that unfortunately we don't tend to, it's really hard to do that. It usually doesn't work. So the other problem is we haven't learned what real trust looks like. And so because we trusted people we had to trust certain people. There wasn't really a choice. It wasn't like you said, I don't like this set of parents. I'm going to go out and find a new set of parents for myself. You don't get to do that. So because you're sort of put into a position of, a friend of mine, Lisa Sunny, always has this really great statement. They're both the knife and the Band-Aid. They're the comfort and the pain. Because you're adults in your life, we're both those things, the knife and the Band-Aid and the comfort and the pain. You've gotten comfortable and familiar with that kind of dynamic, and trust. It's hard to know what trust really looks like. How fast should you trust? What do you trust somebody with? How much information do you give them with? How fast do you let your heart be vulnerable? And because children come out of these homes with a lot of wounds and emptiness, you tend to be hungry for relationship. You tend to want to connect and bond to somebody, almost because not only for you today, because you want a relationship, but also because the you that you once were still wants that reparative experience with a parent, which unfortunately isn't possible. So that's something else I want to cover before we end today, is how do you repair a mother wound or a father wound, something that's sort of you hope to find in your adulthood. You'd love to have it not be a problem, but how do you do that when you can't go back and relive those life experiences? So I'm going to give a word of advice that somebody gave me that I found really, really helpful. So often trust is difficult. We often end up not knowing really what our roles are really well. We tend to do too much or don't do enough in relationships because we've learned it's either better to sort of not be present and be around because it avoids conflict, or we end up doing too much, trying to keep everybody happy and everything safe and sane as a way to sort of keep all the tension down. And as a result, we tend to kind of overextend ourselves or we underextend ourselves. So what are the common myths surrounding childhood abuse and later partner selection? Just because you were abused as a child does not mean you're going to pick a bad partner in adulthood. That is a myth. There is not a direct correlation between a troubled childhood and having bad relationships later on in life. But it does make you more likely to be vulnerable. So I think it's really important for us to do the hard work of looking at our own stuff and making sure that we understand our bent, our fears, our woundedness, our psychological neediness, so that we don't pick other people who either because we're trying to save ourselves back there or we're trying to save an adult that we couldn't save. But it's really important for us to understand these drives that make us look for certain types of people in our life. But just because you had that doesn't mean that that's going to continue to be a problem. In fact, I know if anybody who's been on my lives or hung around me very long knows that I've talked about this before, but Sandra Brown in 2014 in a very large study out of Purdue University looked at 600 pathological love relationships. She wanted to know what was the common variable between all these individuals who got into a pathological love relationship. Most of them, by the way, were women who was in a relationship with a troubled man. That just happened to be her study. It wasn't intentional. It was the population she had access to. There were some men in pathological relationships, but the majority of the participants were women. So I just want you guys to know that that's why I'm going to use the genders that I'm using. The assumption up to then, I got to hear her talk about this. The assumption up to then, based on domestic violence reporting and case studies, was that women, because this is a study of women who gotten into a bad relationship tended to come from troubled homes, that there was a direct correlation between experiencing childhood abuse and getting into a toxic relationship. That was the assumption. What she found, though, is she gave the ACE, which is a childhood, it's an assessment of how much childhood trauma you had, as well as she also took a detailed history and then gave them personality inventories. I think at least 2 personality inventories. And she found there was actually not a strong correlation, that only 1/3 of the population in a pathological love relationship had actually had a troubled childhood or a lot of trauma in their childhood. So only 1/3, 2/3 came from well intact families, had no issues with psychologically with those types of trauma, didn't have particularly difficult trauma, and they still got into a pathological love relationship. What she found was the variables that tended to be consistent across most of the population were their personality types. That the women who gotten into these relationships tended to be overly agreeable and highly conscientious. So, in other words, it was a type of person that made them more vulnerable to the targeting of predatory people, not the fact that they were replicating a troubled home. So, that's a myth. Are you more vulnerable because you came from a troubled home? Absolutely. Does it mean that you're like guaranteed to get into a difficult relationship because you had a troubled home as a kid? No. It just means you're more vulnerable. So here's myth number 2, that victims of childhood are actually attracted to abusive people. No, they're not attracted to abusive people. It's more that what happens is that two traits, the agreeableness and conscientiousness, makes us believe in the goodness of people and that people, the capacity of people to change, and that we tend to overestimate the cooperativeness of people, because those who are highly agreeable and conscientious tend to be very cooperative people, tend to be good team players. Those who have those traits tend to assume that others are like themselves when they're not. They tend to miss the competitiveness that some people, or the antagonism some people have in interpersonal relationships. So I want you to remember that just because you had a difficult home doesn't mean that you're doomed to pick a bad partner. Doesn't mean that you're doomed to repeat that with your own. That it is possible for you to have a very good relationship with in your adult life, irregard, or I know that's not a word. And I'm sure people who are really English majors kind of squirm every time I see it. I like irregardless. I think we need to add it to the dictionary. But anyway, regardless of your past experience, you are able to have really good relationships. So it's not connected. There is a slight connection, but it's not powerful connection. Okay, I've not been able to read your comments because I've not been wearing my glasses, but I want to see what you guys are all having to say, what your thoughts are on this. Okay, so yeah, a lot of comments are coming in. I see my TikTok account is terrible. I have very, very few people on this, and it must be because the internet is so awful. So thanks for those of you who are on TikTok right now. All right, so I'm looking at Facebook and YouTube right now. I'm glad it makes a lot of sense, GMB, that reading this is really, really great. Yeah. Oh, disorganized. Teresa, I meant detached. You know what? I never explained what the detached family looks like. So I described the enmeshed family, but I never described the detached family. I once walked into a home that was like 6,000 square feet, this massive home for a family. And at the bottom of the kind of the introduction to the house, this was like one of those like home on parade sort of a deal. I think that's what it was called, like homes on parade or something that they do every year in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Anyway, so they had a board welcoming those who were visiting this house. And the board said, this is a place with spaces for everyone. There's places and spaces for everyone. And I thought, ooh, that's kind of a detached family system. All right, I'm going to switch my internet connection for TikTok and see if that improves anything. But anyway, that billboard that sort of sat at the entrance of that home describing the size, the scope of this property, I thought captured a detached family structure. So what happens in a detached family structure? Just like I said, an enmeshed family deals with everything as a group. It's sort of like almost, in fact, there's a word, it's called undifferentiated ego mass. It's groupthink is an enmeshed family system. But a detached family system is hyper independent. When they're stressed, instead of coming together, they actually scatter. They pull apart. They don't come together. They run to the corners and avoid each other. They don't really know how to draw strength from each other. They kind of avoid each other. It's sort of like a fear to connect with each other. So think of that as a opposite of enmeshed is detached. Now, most of us don't err in that direction. You're going to see more of that it's just not very common structure. I don't know why. We don't tend to like it. probably because it doesn't really hold together very well. I think that's part of it, is that families that are really detached don't stay together. There's no cohesion, there's no glue to them. So they're not likely to kind of be able to persist. So it's more likely for us to be emotionally infused, emotionally connected. Here's a good, I know sometimes I talk about David Snarf. He's one of my favorite authors. He's no longer with us anymore. He's deceased a couple years ago. But he wrote one of my favorite books called The Passionate Marriage. I highly recommend it. This is a book about how to have a more stable, intimate relationship. It's about how to have great sex, if you want to know. But the way he gets to it is through psychological explanations. And he says the way to really be close to someone is to be able to kind of comfort and soothe yourself, to know how to handle your own insecurities. And by handling them, then you can be more vulnerable and show up in the interpersonal space between you and the other person. So as a result of that, but when we try to manage other people's feelings, think back to the child who's being abused, and mom or dad, whenever they come home, they're even listening for the weight of the footsteps outside the door. They're looking to gauge what kind of emotional space that parent's coming home in, so that they know whether or not they can even talk about what's happened in their day. Like maybe they failed a test and they're already now gearing up, trying to prepare. Should they say something or not say something? I mean, they're all about the management of that household temperature. When you're in a situation like that, it's very hard for you to show up and be vulnerable yourself, because you're taking care of everything outside of yourself to maintain your safety. So to really be intimate and have a lot of vulnerability, we need to be able to have the freedom to take risks and be authentic and to share what we think or feel, while we don't have to manage the other person's reaction and response to it. Most of us, however, are not in a relationship like that. It's weird. I'm still getting the same message on TikTok. I actually turned off Wi-Fi and I don't know what's going on with TikTok today. It's very strange. Anyway, so Kate asked, does detached and enmeshment have any similarities? Yeah, they do, in the sense that there's a lack of intimacy between both of them. You're not, the mesh family is going to be way too involved and up in everybody's space, and there'll be a lot of triangulation going on. But the detached family, on the other hand, there's a lack of connection. So both of them are not going to be very satisfying. You're not going to feel like you can safely be around people and feel seen, like you can show up. So yeah, I think that's how they're similar that way. Where does abuse come from? Teresa, that's a fascinating question. I love the question. I've given this a lot of thought. I think this is just Kerry McAvoy's philosophy on abuse. I think we're abusive because we're insecure. I think we don't know how to hold on to ourselves. We don't know how to deal with our emotion, our insecurities, our shame, our embarrassment, our frustrations. Instead of dealing with them within ourselves and handling them in a mature way, we deal with them interpersonally. And we deal with them by blaming, by justifying, defending, and attacking and avoiding people and situations. I think whenever we don't know how to stand still in the center of ourselves and look at something that's sort of uncomfortable about ourselves or about a situation, and instead we make it about the other person, or we sacrifice somebody in the process, sort of like we have a bad day, we kick the dog, we sacrifice somebody, or we take it out on somebody. That's a way that I think that that's where abuse comes from. I think it's a lack of emotional maturity. I know that sounds sort of like overly little and small and insignificant, but I really think that that's where it is. Oh, I talked about, let me get a drink real quick. I talked about how to deal with these mother and father wounds. So let me jump into that, because I don't want to forget. Because most of us walk away with a wound. We walk away with a hole in ourselves that we really feel broken and empty, and we want to feel fulfilled, and we want to feel seen, and we want to know that we're important, and that what's happening to us matters to somebody in the world. Yeah, seen, I guess, is the best way to say that. So when I was in the middle of that relationship with my toxic ex, I was in counseling the whole entire time. So I was always talking about what was happening in the relationship. And I realized mid to late part of that relationship that I'd been walking around the world looking for a replication of what I didn't have in my own childhood home. That I was sort of like looking for this impossible love that should have been present that just wasn't quite there. And that I had brought that need into this relationship and was hoping that my partner was going to be able to do it. But I also brought that need into in every relationship, not just the partner relationship, but also with friendships as well. That I was basically looking for people to sort of like, can you be my parent? Can you love me? Can you accept me? Can you give me that unconditional regard and acceptance and safety that I felt like I didn't have back there? So this is what she said to me, and it has really been helpful, and I have used it, and it's just been incredible. She said, Kerry, when you encounter something in your adult life that's tough, you know what to do about it. Okay, let me give you, for instance, you guys are driving on the highway and you get a flat tire. You know what to do about a flat tire. Maybe you call AAA. Maybe you have roadside assistance on your insurance plan. Maybe you don't. Maybe you've learned how to change a tire. I certainly know how to change a tire growing up on a farm, but you know what to do as an adult when you hit that kind of situation. The same goes for any kind of situation psychologically. Say that the boss has given you more responsibility than you can manage. You know that probably means you need to sort of show that you've been overwhelmed with the tasks. But when it's a childhood issue, when it's an old issue that you weren't able to solve as a child, those feel overwhelming. They feel so like heavy and weighty, and you don't know how to solve that. That feels very different than an adult problem. And she said, when you get into adult, when you feel that you don't know what to do with it, that it feels so psychologically big and you don't have a solution, she says imagine that you are your own parent, that you come up alongside of that overwhelmed, hurting part of yourself and you provide comfort. Maybe even imagine giving yourself, that little version of yourself, that child version of yourself, a hug. That loving, pulling yourself into an embrace, pulling yourself up onto your lap and comforting yourself when you feel that I don't know what to do with this feeling. I have used that advice many times and it has worked wonderfully for me. So that's something you can try when you feel this woundedness inside you, whether it's a mother wound or a father wound or just some kind of a wound. Imagine yourself when you feel that sense of like, I'm buried by this emotion, pulling yourself into your own, up into your arms and comforting yourself and finding that sort of support. So I really urge you to try that and see if that's been as helpful for you as it's been for me. But it is difficult. Here's the part that I find so hard. There is no going back. You can't replicate. I know that, for example, there are people who say you can use meditation and sort of reparent yourself. Yeah, probably to some extent that you can do that, but I don't think you're going to go back and perfectly heal what's missing, because the truth of the matter is not only was it missing then, but it's still missing today. And you're not going to somehow just pick new people or somehow that's going to fill in these holes so that you don't have these big gaps in your life. I just don't see that as possible. But I do think it's very feasible for us to become aware of where we tend to feel these lacks and these misses, and then learn how to work through them, work around them, or to step ourselves through the process of it. I do think it's very, very possible to do that. So, other types of questions you guys might have for me today. I'm sort of looking through what was said. I'm so glad you're here, by the way, Maria. So you were talking about sort of the family experiences that you had, that you raised two beautiful kids, and that's great. I'm glad you're able to raise two kids despite having a hard childhood. That's really awesome. And my car Keat, I'm glad to know that you think there's nothing wrong with the word irregardless. I know that it's not a word, but I really like that word. It's a great word. What other kind of questions you guys might have? I have about 10 more minutes before we wrap it up here, but I'd love to take your other questions. I'm going to go backwards to see if there are other things that were said. Oh yeah, Teresa was sharing about how she'd gotten a penicillin shot unexpectedly, and how traumatizing that was. It was. One of my kids ended up being dehydrated And he was only, I think, 18 months old. And he'd gotten to the point that they had a difficult time getting an IV in his arm, and they had to wrap him in a sheet to hold him down. They basically restrained him. And oh, I just felt sick hearing that, because I know he didn't understand what was going on. He was way too young for that. I'm glad, Graceful Oaks Fibers, that this information is helping you to understand the why that you're having yourself. Oh, global solidarity. That's interesting that I was taught that she blamed my childhood, that I was taught not to lie, cheat, and steal. We often see the opposite. There are abusive people who will blame their childhood as the reason why they do what they do. It's like that's all they've known, and so that sort of justifies bad behavior today because they've had bad behavior before. They sort of they can't help themselves. That's baloney. Call baloney on that. We're always in control of what we do all the time. Even when we don't want to be in control of what we do, we're in control. So if you hear somebody sort of like offload their bad behavior is sort of like I can't help myself, that they can help themselves. One of the things I think is so important that we learn to do is that we learn to throw space in between what we experience and how we react. So envision it this way, that something happens, it evokes a lot of feelings inside of you. You want to do something with it. You want to maybe react to it or say something, stand up, correct it, do something. If we can just at least take a momentary gap between the experience and our reaction, often we may have other thoughts about what we should do instead. Maybe we realize that we've overreacted. Maybe we realize that it doesn't need a reaction. Maybe we realize this is really more about the other person than it is about ourselves. That we often end up in these situations where we respond too quickly, and then we respond out of our own pain, and we're really and it's response to a person who's also responding out of their pain, and then we just make the situation worse. So if we can slow down enough just to throw in a gap, it can really help us have more control over what we do and how we react to things. That we do make exception for bad behaviors from others. So why do you think that you do? I'd love to hear what are some reasons why you have excused bad behavior? What are some of the things that come off the top of your head? I know for me, I've excused bad behaviors because I thought the person was too hungry or too tired. I kind of thought they couldn't help themselves, but it's interesting, if you really challenge yourself, you don't give yourself that same leeway. It's not like you're able to go off and react poorly just because you're hungry or didn't get enough sleep. Sometimes because we become so understanding that we then sympathize with the person instead of feeling like we should be realize that all of us are adults and we have full control over all our actions. Yeah, that's another good point that you're making, that we do it because we attribute that quality to a certain gender. You know how women are at that time of the month, and then we justify it as that's okay for this person to be extreme. Or we'll say, well, men just can't help themselves because they're a man, or because they just have a lot of testosterone. Well, yeah, but we all have hormonal excuses. That doesn't mean we get excused to be bad just because we have bad moments. Yeah, isn't it interesting? You said you thought he was a good man with a bad temper. Now you know he's a bad man with a temper. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, it is good. It's interesting. And I like your point, Maria, about saying we excuse them as if they're toddlers, but they're adults. And we need to really recognize that we are adults and that toddler behavior isn't attractive in adults. Oh, I like what you're saying, Alejandro. Alejandro is saying, I excuse bad behavior because I don't want to be hurtful to other people. So in other words, Alejandro, what you're saying is to call out bad behavior feels cruel, like you're not being patient or compassionate or supportive. That's a good point. I think we do that a lot. I think we end up thinking that it's compassionate to overlook things when we're really overlooking ourselves in that process. That we need to recognize that we're here, and that not having helpful attention also is hurtful to us. So April said, I feel like guilt plays such a big role. Like it's very easy for me to go back because of the guilt. We often end up feeling obligated to people because of guilt. Like I owe it to save them. Have you guys, I don't know if you've seen Dr. Lindsay Gibson's book. It's the second book called Adult Children Recovering from emotionally immature parents. But at the back of the appendix, she has what she calls the emotional bill of rights. There are 10 rights. I remember the first time I read through them, I was shocked. They felt uncomfortable. These are things that many of us are not taught, that are things that we should expect in a relationship. Like, it's not my obligation to help you to feel good. It's not my obligation to go to do things just because you want it. It's not my obligation to take care of your feelings. There's a lot of really fantastic emotional rights that we tend to sort of assume that we have to manage for other people. Yeah, so Florida girl, I said she said she cared for both of her elderly parents who happened to pass this spring. But they ended up, because of their own childhood wounds, lost a lot of their filters as they were aging. That's common, unfortunately, when the prefrontal cortex starts to, the capacity and the effectiveness diminish. They often lose a filter, and so they can become more abusive. So it's kind of, I bet it was painful for you to see that, for you to see their unfiltered, uglier side of themselves, that they weren't able to kind of modulate and moderate what they were saying and feeling. That would be really painful. Yeah, I agree with you, Maria, that overlooking something once just because it happens at a bad moment for a really rough reason is one thing, but when there's a pattern of behavior, that's something we should really take a significantly different look at. And Teresa, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so Florida girl, you said it's very painful. You still are crying every day and you want to get past it. What's sticking with you that you're struggling to get past with what you heard or experienced as they were failing? So April says, my narcissist is abusive, and then says, I'm not responsible for your happiness, only for my, that's a common one. So let me rephrase it so everybody kind of gets what you just said. And I'm sure a lot of us have had this happen to us. We're in a relationship and the person's cruel. They're critical. They say something nasty. They say something they shouldn't have said. It's ill-timed, it's poorly spoken, and it's probably inaccurate. They're like making some big kind of like assumption. I'm just going to close out TikTok because it is such a failure today. I don't know what happened, but all right. So anyway, let me get out of the way. So something bad happens, and the toxic person blames you for what bad happens and says it's your fault, and you react. You have a normal reaction to it, like it hurt your feelings, it made you cry, maybe it made you really angry, and you even said, why did you have to say that? You didn't have to say that. A toxic person will say, well, it's not my fault. You make yourself feel that way. I didn't make you feel that way. You chose to take it that way, and you chose to be here and stay for it, so therefore it's all your fault. Yeah, it's really interesting. It is a form of defensiveness. I guess that's what I'm saying is, April, is that when people do it that way, they're really like, we do impact each other. We have to admit that we impact each other. We don't, behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. If I come home and kick a dog and then chew the dog out for limping from the way that I kicked it, it didn't occur in the vacuum. There's actually a direct correlation of cause and effect. Bad, ill-tempered, bad behavior has relationship consequences. And people who are toxic don't want that. By the way, they'll be the first to tell you that you were offensive when it's your turn and you somehow did something hurtful. You're going to hear about that for forever. But when it's their turn, what they're really doing is they're avoiding accountability and responsibility. It's just really, that's actually what it is. It's just an unwillingness to look at themselves and know that they have an impact, because in their minds, they sort of see themselves, they do see themselves. They see themselves as superior and outside of the normal rules and normal obligations. So they basically, what they're saying is, somebody else said it already, Rebs said it. They want to get out of jail free card. I agree. They want to have no consequences to any behavior that they do, regardless of what happens. And it's just, it's wrong. It's, that's not the way relationships work. So when you see that and hear that, then that's, to me, would be a sign I'm in a relationship with somebody who will not take accountability, who doesn't see themselves an integral part of this relationship. So Florida girl answered me. She said her mother told her that she was the stupidest person that she'd ever seen. And then her father told her that she was ugly and hateful. despite the fact that she was taking care of them. And then this was near the end of their lives. So here's what I do. I've had people that were very hurtful to me who's passed away too. And I say to myself, they're healed if you believe in an afterlife, and I do. I would say they're healed and they've changed and they're their full healthy self. And today, if they could somehow interact with me, they would say, I never meant that. I was not well. I was losing my mind and I was very not well. And I said things that I shouldn't have said because of my lack of wellness and my poor health. And I'm really sorry. And that's not how I see you at all. In fact, I see the sacrifices that you made for me, and I dearly love you and appreciated it because you did way above and beyond for me. So that's what I would focus on. I would focus on the fact that I do believe in an afterlife with complete healing, and the healed, whole, healthy, secure person would have a completely different tact on this. In fact, that's just a thought. You might want to, for example, write a letter to yourself as if you're that whole healthy adult, that parent who now is completely healed, and write it to you, and with a recognition of what you did and what your sacrifice meant, and what they saw and how deeply they appreciate it, how much love they felt from you for what you did. So I would do that as a way to sort of like as if they wrote it to you. And I think that would be a beautiful gift for yourself. Any other last comments today? This was a hard topic, honestly, for me. I didn't really enjoy talking about it. It's painful because a lot of us have had a lot of rough experiences in our life. But thank you for being with me today about it, because here's the thing I get really nervous about. I don't like blaming victims for bad relationships. And I really hope that you didn't hear me say that today, because I don't think it's true. I really hope you heard my explanation. We're not picking something because it's familiar. We're picking something because we want it to succeed and we want it better. We're picking it because we love people and we know people are flawed and we really believe that things can get healthier and better. And we're trying to repair that. We don't do it just because we hate ourselves and we like to just beat ourselves up and abuse ourselves further. I don't believe in that. Strongly, strongly do not believe in that. But I do know there is a pull accidentally to repeat things if we're not careful and observant. One thing that you guys can all do to not repeat your bad patterns if you've gotten out of a narcissistically abusive relationship is I'd love you to become a participant in the upcoming Healing Strong group coaching program that starts October 30th. It goes for 12 weeks. It's with Lisa, Sunny, and myself. We've opened a new group. It's been so popular. We sold out the first two for this fall. So we opened a third, and I'd love to have you sign up. So if you've been on the fence thinking, I'm not really healing as well as I'd like to heal, I still have some things to address, or I'm so stuck on rumination, or I can't get over the rage, or I know I'll never have closure and I just can't be at peace with it. If you just feel that restlessness, stuckness, maybe you're still feeling a lot of fear, maybe you don't know how to get out of that fight or flight, consider joining the 12-week live group coaching program called Healing Strong. It's with Lisa, Sunny, and myself, and it starts October 30th. It's only for a small group of people, both men and women. We only have 8 spots. One's already taken, so I would love to fill it up with the rest of you because I would love to work with you. Not only do you get to work on the content, like how to overcome guilt, find closure, how to stop rumination, how to make sense of the trauma bond and break it, but you also get to meet 7 other people to build a relationship and find out that you're not alone, to get validation. I'll tell you, it's not just the information and the strategy and skill building that we do with you, because it's a lot of there's a lot of exercises in this experience, but it's getting to hear that you're not alone, that other people are struggling with this too, can be so normalizing. So if you've been on the fence about wanting to take your healing up a next level, maybe you've done counseling, maybe you've done EMDR, but you're still feeling like there's something missing, I urge you to take Healing Strong. I think it's going to be a fabulous experience, and I would love to work with you and get to know you better. Yeah, so April, that would be a great thing for you to think about. If you're interested, go to my website. It's kerrymcavoyphd.com/healing-strong/. That's how you get to it. Healing-strong/. So go to my website, and then you can check out it at healing-strong. I would love to see you guys there. All right. Hey, I'm going to be back next week. So the topic for next week is, why are narcissists narcissists? So I'm going to put it there right now, April. Hang around, even though if this ends, I'll put it in there. It's also in I think it's in the show notes too. So, but next week we're going to cover, why are narcissists narcissists? I'm having an interview with Dr. Peter Salerno on the podcast, which I'm super excited about. If you guys don't know who he is, I don't think he's on YouTube. Maybe he is, but he's on Instagram and on TikTok. Peter Salerno. Dr. Peter Salerno is his tag. He's going to be my guest this upcoming Monday. And he's going to break a lot of the myths we have and hold about narcissists. So let's get into it next week. Let's talk about what makes a narcissist. So I'll see you back here on Tuesday at 4 p.m. And until then, you guys stay safe and sane. And I'm sending you all a big, big hug. Bye-bye.